Okay, so it's time. It's 8:30, and it's time to begin. So we are really happy and privileged to have with us Professor Tony Stewart. Um, he needs no introduction. He is a very well-known name, as we all know, in the field of South Asian religious studies. And since we began this project, we kept on thinking about him. We studied some of his books. He has written so many articles and books in this field. Would be honest that we haven't been able to read all the works, but we have began, and that's good. And we have plans to read many of his other works. And that's why we decided that we should begin engaging with him both through his text as well as in person. It would have been wonderful had we been able to invite him to Kolkata, but it's not possible right now. And we are also grateful to Professor Stewart because, in spite of his medical emergencies, he decided to accept this invitation, and he's here with us today. Um, as we know that from the name itself, we understand that this project is about locating and remapping the minor intellectual traditions. Professor Stewart has sent his detailed full CV to me, and I will be forwarding it to all my colleagues so that they can have a look. But right now, it is customary that I read out a brief bio note of Professor Stewart. He did his studies from the University of Chicago, and currently he is Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Chair in Humanities and Emeritus Professor of Religious Studies at Vanderbilt University. Professor Stewart has looked into the Hindu traditions and focused mainly on the creation of the Gaudiya Vaishnava movement of the 16th and 17th centuries. And he has also looked into the results of which we can find in his monograph titled The Final Word, the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and the Grammar of Religious Traditions, published in 2010 from Oxford University Press. This work was preceded by and dependent on a translation of the key text, the encyclopedic Chaitanya Charitamrita of Krishnadasa Kaviraja, which he produced with the late Edward Dimmock, and that was published from the Harvard Oriental series. Um, Followers of the Vaishnava traditions, we know, also recognize a figure named the Satyapir, who is known in Bengal as the Satyanarayana Satyapir, which provided a link into the Islamic literatures of Bengal, and especially in the area known as Bangladesh. Satyapir, who is considered to be both an avatar of Krishna as well as a Sufi saint, represents a rapprochement of Muslims and Hindus in a plural Bengali society in the pre-modern period, something that we miss today in today's India of highly polarized sectarian uh, sectarian violences and other conflicts. So in Fabulous Females and Peerless Peers, published in 2004 from Oxford University Press, Professor Stewart translated 8 tales out of several hundred, each focused on the ways women, aided by Satyapir, kept the world ordered in the wake of male-generated chaos. This is also very important. It's very patriarchal, this world of warmongering and conflict, and how these stories are important and relevant for us today. So that literature in turn prompted him to write Witness to Marvels, Sufism and Literary Imagination, published from California University Press in 2019, which examines the ways the Islamic imaginary has insinuated itself seamlessly into a Bengali consciousness through mythic heroes who extend their help and protection to anyone, regardless of sectarian affiliation. The accompanying anthology of unabridged translations of those key tales has recently appeared as a very important volume, which we are just talking to Professor Stewart, named Needle at the Bottom of the Sea, Bengali Tales from the Land of the 18 Tides, published by California University Press in 2023. As I said that this is a brief introduction. I'll be circulating the latest CV to all of you so that you can get to know the detail. This much for the beginning. Professor Stewart will be speaking for 30 minutes. He has a doctor appointment after the talk. So After his talk, we'll have a couple of questions, some questions and discussions, and then we'll call it closed. So without wasting further time, it's over to Professor Tony Stewart.
Well, thank you very much, and thank everyone from the Institute of Language Studies and Research. I'm really excited to hear more about your project on mapping minor intellectual traditions. I wasn't given a specific topic to talk about, so I decided to ruminate on why and how I came to investigate these seemingly obscure figures, such as Chateaubriand and the heroes of other Pir Kata, when no one else, it seemed, had bothered. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, while I was working on my dissertation on the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sahitya dedicated to Chaitanya, I kept running across material about Satyanarayan and Chateaubriand, who were, strangely enough to my sensibilities, somehow the same. Let's see if I can get this to, there we go. I bought or copied everything that crossed my path in the bookstalls of College Street, even though I had no idea at the time what any of it really meant. And on occasion, I took the time to pilfer the manuscript collections of Bangla Bibag at Calcutta University and at the Asiatic Society at Bangla Sahitya Parishad, because I sensed that a figure who conjoined Hindus and Muslims in common worship must be either an oddity worth noting or something potentially much more profound. So about 1990, I began to survey the material and was astonished to discover that I had about 1.5 file cabinet drawers filled with original or copied material. That is about 5 feet if you stacked it straight up. So I decided to work through it systematically. I soon found myself in the old India Office Library in Blackfriars in London before it was merged with the British Museum's Oriental Collection to create the current Asian and African collections of the British Library. And there I was able to pull up and copy literally scores of titles. After spending weeks and weeks, up to the point where I exhausted the print catalog holdings, I was frustrated because I kept seeing references to texts that I couldn't find. And with the intervention of Graham Shaw, who was then Deputy Director of Collections, I was given, and who was himself a Bengali specialist, I was given access to some handwritten card catalogs recorded on blue slips, which I dubbed the secret blue catalogs. These were Bangla books which were otherwise unregistered in the system. It was a treasure trove, and actually Fabulous Females and Peerless Peers is largely the result of those that blue catalog. Then I got a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to further examine these materials, and I proceeded to scour holdings in repositories in Dhaka, Dhaka University, the Bangla Academy, the Asiatic Society of Bangladesh, and so forth. And of course, I turned my attention to manuscripts with the guidance of the incredible Catalogus Catalogorum of Bengali manuscripts compiled by Jitendra Mohan Bhattacharya. It's old-fashioned scholarship. There's no substitute for spending time in the library, no matter how much material is digitized. Although digitizing is changing the way we approach these things, it's right now sort of like icing on the cake. During the decade of the 80s, before the digitization process, I discovered that there were actually fewer than 80 pages of secondary literature dedicated to the figure of Chateaubriand. But I had found more than 800 Hastalikito Puntis, 250 or more printed texts, and by more than 100 different authors. The block of literature was second in size only to the Gaudiya Vaishnava corpus, yet no one seemed to know anything about it. No one seemed to care about it, and certainly nothing was being written about it. So I began to ask the obvious question: how could such a massive literature and its accompanying religious community circulate these tales, yet go completely missing in the scholastic record? So I turned my concerns, my colleague Carl Ernst in Chapel Hill, I was in the Triangle at the time, And Carl and I taught in 1996 NEH summer seminar called Rethinking Religious Boundaries in South Asia. Because the more I looked at Shatopir and Shatonarayan material, and the more he worked through his Sufi materials, we found that the absolute division of Hindu and Muslim, as was routinely articulated in the press, in scholarship, and of course in politics, was really untenable. It failed to account for the historical experience, particularly of the pre-modern era, of many religious practitioners in South Asia. The evidence suggested that the communities marked by these categories were not so starkly demarcated. It became clear that the perceived absolute division of Hindu and Muslim was a very late development, a 19th and 20th century issue, and even more so today, as you've already alluded. It was a political issue more than a religious issue. A number of us in the Triangle South Asia Consortium, which was faculty from North Carolina, University of North Carolina, Duke University, and North Carolina State, were investigating the etiology of this categorical divide. The historians among us began to argue that the categories were a colonial construct, but which became instantiated in the first census in 1882, when the category of religion was included in the questions. It was a checkbox, which was, of course, divisive: Hindu, Muslim, Christian, or other. The logic of the census was predicated on the law of the excluded middle. You can't be two things at once. So they are, by definition, mutually exclusive. So it was conceptualized as an either-or proposition. But how does one talk about Hindus and Muslims without those labels implying exclusion, without those labels becoming part of an identity politics? And especially when I possessed a massive literature that countermanded the proposition. So these were my first forays into attempting to answer that question. And there's several essays here, which I hope you'll have a chance to read if you haven't already. It sounds like many of you have, actually. But popular scholarly portrayal of Shatopir and Shatonarayan, or the portrayals of Sufi and Nath practitioners, was that they were syncretists. They were confused, combining religious beliefs and practices that were never intended to be joined. They were, in other words, impure. To describe the phenomenon of individuals or groups who seem to confuse and conflate the categories, the term syncretism was deployed. And syncretism, as it's used in this manner, was a bad word. And such practitioners were not good Muslims, nor were they good Hindus. So out of our seminar, Carl and I wrote a piece on syncretism as it applied to South Asia. As we demonstrated, the concept of syncretism does not describe a process. Rather, it hinges on presupposed outcomes, which is a version of the fallacy of petitio principii, assuming your conclusion. The elements brought together, according to the users of this, were never intended to be together. So thought scholars. So the results of any experiment along these lines is invalid. When two or more distinct entities are brought together in a way that violates their supposed exclusion, the result is a new syncretic entity that, because of its unholy alliance, cannot endure. The implication was that it was not permanent. Unholy was definitely the word, for we discovered the roots of the concept of syncretism were to be found in the literatures of Christian heresies, obviously a very negative concept. But we also realized that nearly all the terminology for syncretism was metaphoric, which is not surprising for any abstraction. But in this case, all the terms had negative entailments. And here I follow Lakoff and Johnson's Metaphors We Live By for looking at the entailments of metaphor. I highly recommend that book, by the way, Metaphors We Live By. There were four basic approaches. The first was influence and borrowing. It turns out that the origin of the notion of influence is really astrology. How do the planets pull the individual in certain ways? And it was a kind of mysterious connection that couldn't be actually specifically identified, but we knew somehow must be there. The second was the cultural veneer. The veneer is pretty, but it's a thin layer of Islamic culture on the bedrock of Hindu culture, but it delaminates anytime it gets wet. So again, the implication of this beautiful metaphor of the uh, cultural veneer is actually voided because of its tendency to be easily damaged, which means it's not permanent. There was alchemy, wizards working magic. If you think of a colloidal suspension, for instance, oil and vinegar, you shake up oil and vinegar and you have this beautiful suspension, for your salads or whatever. And then you set it on the counter and turn your back, and a minute later, they've separated again into their constituent parts. So again, the image of the mixture is one that's negative. And then finally, the most telling of all of the images was the organic or biological reproduction, hybrids. You bring together two animals or plants that are not supposed to be together, and they produce something that we call a hybrid. But the problem with the hybrid, guess what, is it can't reproduce, which means that the hybrid is only the result of bringing them together, but can't perpetuate itself. Now, let me very quickly add, scientists, being who and what they are, have managed actually to get some hybrids to reproduce. But there is a kind of astonishing end result, which is that the young that are produced from the joining of two hybrids disaggregates into one or the other of the grandparents. So when you bring these two things together, they can produce a hybrid, but the hybrids themselves, once again, cannot perpetuate their image as hybrid because it disaggregates. So in all the models, the assumption that the parts were not to be combined ensured that they did not stay that way. This ultimately led me to contemplate issues of linguistic categories. And at this point, I realized that many of the issues that kept us from seeing these literatures were in fact linguistic. The terms we used established categories, and how we constructed the categories by which we ran our inquiries predispose the outcomes. So could I develop a new strategy for understanding how a figure, such as Shaktopir cum Shaktonarayan, could thrive? Following the model of our analysis of syncretism, whenever possible, I began to refrain from using the terms Hindu and Muslim as instantiated categories, that is, as fixed entities, that is, as nouns, especially since many of the terms were not religious but ethnic. For instance, Jabon. Today, Jabon is automatically translated as Muslim, but in fact, that's not what Jabon means. It comes from Ionian, from the Greek. And I did a thought experiment when I started thinking about how this affected my reading. When I read Jabon as Muslim versus I read Jabon as a man with a hat and a beard, I got a very different response from the use of the term. And it's shifted from religion into ethnic and cultural categories that were not as loaded as the Hindu and Muslim categories. So I then began to adopt adjectival designations, Musulmani and Hinduani, to describe those whose actions were oriented or inclined or affected by the traditional values of those communities. This led ultimately to two interrelated interpretive strategies. One was seeking equivalence, and the other was recognizing the limiting conditions of categories, that is, agnotology. In linguistic equivalence, in the early modern period, Musulmans tried to express their religious truth in a new language, Bangla. They were not confused by using terms such as Niranjan or Ishwar for God, or even Avatar for Muhammad. In fact, just think about the etymology of Avatar. You have the root, the Sanskrit root tur, to cross over, plus the prefix ava, which means down. So that is to come down to earth, or in this case, descend from the heavens. and in traditional Indic terms, Hinduvani terms, that is from the Gita, chapter 4, Krishna, in order to set right the world. Now, Muhammad is pictured in much the same way. He was born on this earth, and many accounts will say he actually pre-existed and descended from heaven. He was sent by God to set right the world, to show the way. And you can immediately see the notion of equivalence. Translation theory gave me a model for conceptualizing this interaction. And the article In Search of Equivalence is the one that articulates that, which I hope you've had a chance to read. The Nobi Bongsho of Zaid Sultan is a wonderful example. It's a book that was initially hailed for the making the story of Muhammad available to the benighted masses of Bengal. In fact, he actually says that explicitly. But by the 19th century, it was vilified as being un-Islamic because he used terms like avatar and Niranjan. And I would direct you to the wonderful work of Ayesha Irani, whose book, The Muhammad Avatar, Salvation History, Translation, and the Making of Bengali Islam, is a masterpiece at parsing the activities that are going on in this book. And she's used many of the issues that I've laid out, particularly regarding presupposition and presupposition and intertextuality. Now, the result of all this is that I turn to the term equivalence, seeking equivalence in a language that did not yet have technical vocabulary supposed by Persian and Arabic. Eventually, of course, these technical terms were incorporated into Bangla, but not initially. That is, not during the early centuries during which Shatopir and Shatonarayan were proposed to share an identity, which actually dates back to the late 15th, early 16th century. But few people recognize that while the technical terminology was slowly incorporated into the language, the semantic field of the new terms was not identical to their Persian and Arabic origins. And I talk about this a little bit in the introductory matter of Witness to Marvels. And in fact, if you look in the second chapter, the story of Badar Pir in Witness to Marvels, we get Allah, and it's Allah in Bangla, not the Persian pronunciation. Allah is cruising around the heavens in his Biman. Now, I challenge anybody in the world to find me an Arabic or Persian or Turkish or any other language version of God's activities in the heavens that includes him cruising around the heavens in the Biman and looking out over the edge of the Biman and spotting someone and then deciding to send help to those who need it. This is a uniquely Bangla phenomenon, and I think many of the terms that get imported ultimately do have slight changes in their semantic field. Now, this, of course, changed the way I transliterated terms, and I began ruthlessly to follow the transliterations directly from the Bangla, not retranslating it back into Persian or Arabic. And the knotty issues of this language, I think, are touched on, at least in some ways, by Epshita Halder, another one of my students, whose book Reclaiming Karbala, Nation, Islam, and Literature of the Bengali Muslims, which just came out last year and has won the Indian History Congress Award for Indian Literature and Culture, and rightly so. These issues also led to the concern about what constituted a religious language. And it's a dead end because there is no such thing as a religious language, but I don't want to get sidetracked by that. It led me, though, to a related set of issues, which is that of agnotology. Agnotology is bound up with category formation. And we cannot see things that are right before our eyes because of the categories that we use to construct our inquiry and organize our knowledge. Look at the case of syncretism. Because we assume in advance they don't belong together, then all the images of syncretism produce a negative result. In epistemology, agnotology was seen as ignorance, the structure of our ignorance. But in the sociology of epistemology, which examines structures of knowledge and their power relations, agnotology is characterized differently as the failure to recognize or know. Now, this is not the same as ignorance. Rather, it's the study of our intellectual blind spots, largely caused by the limiting power of category formation. And I depend here on this book by Proctor and Schiebinger. It's a series of essays on agnotology, which I highly recommend, and especially Nancy Tuana's essay, which is a whimsical piece, but just devastatingly spot on, where she examines the way male doctors failed to understand female anatomy for centuries, until the Boston Women's Hospital began to look at the nature of the clitoris, and they discovered that it was a much larger and active organ than anybody had imagined for centuries. And this was done not until the late 1990s. And it's because they had decided it wasn't involved in procreation, therefore it wasn't important. So the categories blinded people to its presence. So I want to point out now some Bengali examples of just this kind of thing. And I'm really sticking my neck out now because we're looking here at texts from three of the greatest scholars to ever study Bengal. But first is Shoshi Bhushan Dasgupta's obscure religious cults. In the obscure religious cults, which is just a monument of scholarship, he categorizes these different groups as fringe, as obscure, as esoteric, which means not mainstream, difficult to understand, aberrant, or worse, hiding or dealing with issues that proper society shouldn't be dealing with. And I actually touched on some of this in an article. I don't have it listed here on the PowerPoint, which is The Power of the Secret, the tantalizing discourse of Vaishnava Shahajiya scholarship, which actually extends to look at the larger issues. But Maninder Mohan Bose also is, on the one hand, responsible for bringing to our attention the incredibly complex world of the post-Chaitanya Shahajiya cult. At the same time, he eliminated hundreds and hundreds of padabali that do not fit into the construction of Shahajiya religion that he was attempting to make. So on the one hand, he brings to our attention, and on the other hand, he produces a very narrow, focused result, which, quite frankly, skips and misses what much of the manuscript material that I've looked at over the last decades shows was going on. Part of this issue, everybody knows about the Shahajiyas, but if you ask any scholar who's working on Shahajiya material, what makes a text Shahajiya, they either point to Imam Bose or they just throw up their hands and say, I don't know, I'll know it. I know it when I see it. So again, the pitfalls here of the categories that are constructed. No one looks at the Shahajiyas now except through the lens of Imam Bose. Now, this affects our readings. When we label things as obscure or we label something a cult, it affects our interpretations, our readings. We tend to devalue them, and as a result, we sideline them. This is one reason why I'm really excited about your current project. Other seemingly benign terms, and they often seem to be benign, actually end up doing the same thing. So, for instance, categorizing something as folklore or folk religion or popular religion or the stories as folk tales or old wives' tales. All of these have a way of marginalizing because they designate the subject as non-mainstream and therefore not worthy or as worthy of inquiry. Folk literature, for instance, is not high literature, and therefore you don't bring to bear the literary tools to interpret it that you would, say, a novel by Rabindranath. So here I would caution, and I just hope you keep this in the forefront of your inquiries, that your minor traditions, just by calling them minor, might inadvertently skew their reception. So where do these categories come from? This is something that plagued me. And I realized this is the quiet power of the scholar, which ultimately means scholars in institutions, which means then universities, and from universities, to be successful, it means publishing houses through the medium of print. So we should not underestimate that power. Now, I have here on the screen Shukumar Shen's Islami Bangla Sahitya. This little book, it's only 155 pages, small pages, is nothing more than a retelling of many of the Pir Kitab. There are no analyses at all because they weren't deemed sufficiently sophisticated to bother with. And so, as a result, he has separated out this literature and they're never incorporated into his massive and just monumental Bangla Sahitya Itihas. I mean, that's almost 3,000 pages of the history of Bangla literature. I mean, it's a monument of scholarship like we've never seen. I mean, it has been replicated in some ways by other authors, but this was just monumental. And yet he sidelines these Pir Kitab as not worthy. And even though Islama Bangla Sahitya was published long before the reprints of Bangla Sahitya Itihas, he never incorporates it into that set of essays. So, in other words, it's not taken seriously as literature. Now, from my publications, I think you know how I respond to that. And I praise Shukumar Shen for his monumental work, and I fault Shukumar Shen for excluding this material. So the power of print culture, the irony of print culture, is that it preserves a certain memory, but it steers one away from the richness of tradition. Sources that are often only found today in unpublished manuscripts, and unpublished here is the trick. So it's an issue of scholarly access. As you know, in order to look at manuscripts, you have to go to the repository in person. And even if you go, you may or may not have access, or at least regular access. There will be restrictions on the use and circulation of manuscripts. There are restrictions on their publication and on their translation. But it's an economic issue as well. Once something is written, will it have sufficient readers? That is, the requisite numbers to make it worth the while of the publisher. So between the universities and their repositories and the publishers and their concerns to have large circulations, the scholar is really steered away from these minor traditions because they don't pay off in the same way. Now, this, of course, really becomes evident, and I first stumbled across this in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, and this is actually much of what the final word is about, how the institutions of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas really controlled and their presses worked the system of the Vaishnava story to create a master narrative. And that's what the final word is about, the creation of this master narrative. But the manuscripts, if you take the time to go and actually read many of these manuscripts. Frequently, they're incomplete. Often it's a single text. Occasionally, there'll be multiple copies, but often not. There's plenty of evidence of alternate but now unknown traditions from quite literally hundreds of unpublished puntis. And I have, over the years, starting back in the late 70s, I started looking at these manuscripts. And I have notes. I was surprised to discover last year, as I was going through after my retirement, I was going through my papers and discovered I have notes on several hundred of these alternate traditions within the Vaishnava tradition that are not necessarily Gaudiya in their orientation. So then the question is, what kinds of new strategies can we develop for interpreting these tales? Now, unless you're an anthropologist where you can go into the field and interact with the practitioners of these various small traditions, you must rely on the literature, on the tales, whether they're oral or written. And so we need to adopt a strategy of interpretation, or at least one strategy that is commensurate to the material. So we need literary tools. And this, of course, is the impetus behind Witness to Marvels. More than anything else, we have tales, we have narratives. Now, I say that somewhat reservedly because today, with all of the mobile phone, where you can not only photograph but actually produce videos, we have a lot more than that for contemporary times. But prior to the last decade or so, what we have are stories. Now, story literature produces narrative truth, which is very different. It's theologically light. It takes a different form from theological or even logical or rational truth. It has a very weak institutional base, and it mythologizes rather than theologizing or historicizing. That is, narrative truth uses stories to illustrate through image and metaphor. So how do we approach story? And I came to ask the question for my work, and there are many other questions that can be asked, but for my work is, what cultural work does a story do? And my first foray was religion in the subjunctive, Vaishnava narrative, Sufi counter narrative in early modern Bengal. And it was a very tentative sort of dipping my toe into the waters. But it led ultimately to my detailed study and longer term study of Witness to Marvels, Sufism and Literary Imagination. I want to add to, for those of you who have the book, and I'm glad I was quite adamant that it become open access, and Shahzad Bashir in his Islamic Humanities series made that possible, and I thank him enormously because it's very expensive to produce an open access book. The book is actually meant to be read straight through because it constitutes a single argument from the first page to the last. And it's organized according to the 3 stages of semiotics. So it starts with syntactics, which is the story itself. It moves then hand in hand, the syntactics with the semantics, that is the interpretation of the story. And then finally, in the last chapter, with the pragmatics, the effect of these stories in real life. The last 2 chapters, actually, not just one. And then I followed that with Needle at the Bottom of the Sea, so that other people could look at these tales and see for themselves. One of the things I discovered when I first started sharing these stories, I would summarize the stories to my audiences, and people didn't believe me. And I actually had a faculty member and one student in 2 separate presentations stand up and say, we don't believe that that's what the story actually said. You're misreading the story or you're making it up. And so I then began to include lengthy sections of translated material and I am quite adamantly a translator of an unabridged translator. So every single word, every single concept is dealt with. And it's only then do people begin to see that I'm not kidding, that this actually is what's going on. And so you can see now in Witness to Marvels or Needle at the Bottom of the Sea, you get the full stories, but notice you never get a positive or explicit statement about what constitutes the religion, though the leading figures are today all considered religious. The authors assume you know. And as Bakhtin and Mashai have argued, and I refer you to chapters 3 and 4 in Witness to Marvels, the stories provide only a simulacrum of religion. So you get a portrayal of how these leading religious figures, Shakto Pir, Bon Bibi, Khwaja Khizr, Gaji Pir, Manik Pir, and others, navigate the Bangla culture of the early modern period. And in so doing, the stories generate a commentary, an ongoing commentary on reality. In fact, this is one of the most important functions of literature in any culture. Now, Wolfgang Iser has persuasively argued that a fiction, and I treat all of these as fictions, automatically comments on or critiques ordinary discourse. It can't reproduce its values. It can only remark those possibilities that have been excluded by the prevailing system. So it's a kind of negative image of what's going on in culture, and it provides alternatives, explorations of what might be. Here then, for the inquiries into these theologically light story traditions, the stories are in field work or in the manuscripts. And the number, as I've already said, of manuscripts, extant manuscripts, is truly staggering. These so-called smaller traditions are precisely the forms of religion that are left out of the institutions, religious, educational, political, publishing, that dominate the cultures of the Bangla-speaking world today. But this world of the imaginaire is not unstructured. Rather, as I've argued in Witness to Marvels, it builds on pre-existing assumptions, logical and pragmatic, and forms of intertextuality, overt and covert. And all of these make the tales understandable. And because of this context, and remember, no text ever comes into or exists in a vacuum, we can make sense of what, according to standard categories, might not appear to be serious or valid. And we can learn to ask questions that have answers. And it applies to traditions across the board, all the varieties of Hindu and Islamic, of Nat and Christian, of Buddhist and Adivashi religious stories. Now, there are any number of texts, many such stories that I've looked at over the years. I recently wrote an article on the English Nama. I'm working on an article on the Chaitanya Nityananda Janavi Tattva, as examples of non-traditional narratives. How I want to end, though, is I want to look at a text, it appears to be a Shi'i composition, that tells of Ali's failure to fathom the extraordinary nature of Fatima, but as we'll see, it's anything but traditional or transparent. So it's a late 17th century text, and I spotted this text in Dhaka University libraries, I don't know, about in the 90s. And I'm delighted to say now that Sherbaj Khan, a young historian in the Dhaka University History Department, has transcribed this text, which appears in both Persian and Bangla. So let me summarize this text to give you an idea of how far we have to go in even identifying the different groups and approaches to religion that challenge basically everything we know. So here's a summary of the story. Ali was told by Abu Bakr that Allah had endowed Fatima with a special surat, a beauty of form that was extraordinary and was not to be revealed until the day of final judgment. Now, Ali knew nothing about it, and in a fury, he demanded she show him, in spite of the warning that it would have disastrous consequences. He badgered her so long that finally she relented. She sent Ali into the forest, where he glimpsed several extraordinary visions. The first vision, he saw a fakir sitting inside a fire doing namaz, while his brains were boiling out, and was tended by a female skeleton. A little further along the path, he encountered another female skeleton who was cooking chapatis for Niranjan. Then a myna bird flew by and he chased it, and this myna bird was inscribed with verses of the Quran. It wore a crown, a tiara, a necklace, and earrings. But the myna flew into a masjid, but the way was blocked by an old crone, an old woman lying on a funerary litter. He could not budge her out of the way. She was so heavy, so he had to crawl under the cot to get inside. But once inside, what he saw was actually the throne of God, with two boys on either side reading Quran. Ali failed to realize that Muhammad was the fakir and Fatima was both skeletons, that she was also the myna bird and the old crone who was burdened by 18,000 souls awaiting judgment, hence her unmovable weight. And finally, that Hassan and Hussein, his sons, were the two boys at the throne of God. So frustrated and angered by Ali's obtuseness at not recognizing these multiple realities that constituted her identity, Fatima pulled aside her cloak once, then twice, and each time the revelation was accompanied by violent lightning and thunder. And finally, she bared herself completely the third time to reveal her truly unfathomable form. And the resulting cataclysm, the shock, knocked out Ali and everyone else present. Eventually, Muhammad wakes up and comes to. He awakens Fatima, and Fatima adjusts her disheveled state, that is, she covers over her form, and then she attends to Muhammad, Ali, and her sons in that order. That's the end of the story. And while we might not be thrilled with the abrupt ending, we can situate this text by the way it is constituted in the Bengali imaginaire, which is far richer than we normally acknowledge. And I think I'll leave it right there. Shock.
Thank you. Thank you so much uh, for the presentation.